Hey everybody, my name's Derek, CEO and founder of Wenwyn, helping you when you need a win at the intersection of leadership and culture. This is part three of a three-part interdependent series exploring, and this is how these three things relate, cities, churches, and leaders. We've talked about cities. We've talked about transcendence and belonging and why that matters to the longing of a city. We've talked then about churches and how, if there is transcendence, churches have a role in the city, and why it is that many cities ignore churches and what the churches can bring, or what churches can bring to a city. In this episode, I want to talk about individual leaders and why leaders matter, why they matter, and we're going to go right back up, why they matter to their churches, why they matter to their cities, and then, of course, why they matter to global trends, why they matter at large. Okay. Before I get started, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button or hit the like button. We would love to continue to bring you more content to help you. I know it's tough. You look at the evening news, you feel like you have some theory, you feel like your world is kind of breaking down, and at the same time, you know you're supposed to be a part of it, and you're trying to figure out a way through. You're leading yourself, you're leading your family, you're leading an organization, you're leading a business, and life can get pretty complex. But listen, we're here to help. We really do want to help you, and you matter. You matter to the world. You matter to what's happening everywhere. Let's talk about leadership. There's been a whole lot of material written on leadership, particularly in the 20th century, the latter part of the 20th century, and into the 21st century. Some of my favorite books are on leaders. Some of my favorite speakers talk about leaders. John Maxwell, Craig Rochelle, Christian Economic Forum, Willow Creek every year has a whole leadership conference, global leaders conference. And it's a great forum where churches and leaders can connect and cities can connect. I love that intersection. Again, culture, leadership. And there's some great ways out there for fantastic interaction. Leaders and leadership in the church lately has come under a lot of fire, only because what's happened is there's been so much emphasis on leadership that there's been a lack of emphasis on what it means to be a servant, a lack of emphasis on humility. Suddenly, when we talk about leaders in churches or at the dinner table or in your corporation or in your nonprofit, that becomes synonymous with practices and principles rather than character or submission to someone beyond you, to a higher sense of transcendence. And I think there's a point there. I think there has been a slight overcorrection. And what happens is now we have churches that are filled with pastoral leaders who actually don't think at all like pastors. They think more in terms of corporate leadership. And if you were formerly in the corporate business world and God called you into church leadership, you understand that there really is a pretty big distinction between the two. Now, there's some crossover skills. I happen to have an undergrad degree in organizational management. I got it because when I was coming up and I was an early pastor, my leadership circle, the guys I really looked up to, that I was getting advice from, they said, before you get your theology degree, go get a good organizational management degree. Turns out that was great advice. A lot of those organizational management skills came in really handy when I was pastoring a church. I still needed the theology, but they were right that there are some crossover skills that are important to apply. However, a business is not a church. A nonprofit, though churches are nonprofits, but a nonprofit entity, a parachurch or a nonprofit of any other type, that's not a church either. And humility does matter. It matters to the very heart of who Jesus is. In Philippians 2, Jesus says he came taking on the nature of a servant. Now, service is sometimes equated with, German would say being a Waschlappe, but equated with this idea of being kind of a mamby-pamby person that everybody just orders you around and you don't have any backbone. But that is actually not humility. There's a great strength in humility, and humility is a quiet confidence in knowing who to trust. And there's a real challenge there because if your trust is all in yourself, that can translate into a need for power rather than a sense of transcendence that your trust is in someone who's greater than you, and that drives your sense of learning and humility forward. Um, Having said that, leadership does matter. And I think sometimes in the counter argument to the leadership materials that are out there with regard to church and spirituality, we tend to forget that actually leaders really do matter. You can have two people of equal character, and one is simply a better leader than the other person is. Now, calling matters to that. I don't want to have a leader who's not called, but I also don't want to have a leader who is not a leader. And this really boils down to how you view people, how you view influence. It's funny. Those who would say, well, it's not about leadership. You could just insert anybody. It's, the one person doesn't really matter. By the way, there's a whole view of history that says, one person makes zero difference to the progress of history. And I just disagree. I fundamentally disagree. I think every individual really does matter. And we might think it doesn't, but it's funny how we never apply that theory to our own families or our own marriages. Um, okay, do you really think your choice of a spouse doesn't matter? It's irrelevant to the culture and health of your marriage or your family? That's nonsensical. Of course it matters. Okay, what about a brother-in-law, sister-in-law? Of course it matters. And you can kind of broaden out from there. Individuals matter. How they make choices matters. How they influence others in leading them to make choices matters. The kind of conviction that they lead with, not in terms of being louder, but in knowing why they're making the decision that they're making matters. And you can have charismatic leaders that are bad leaders. I would cite some of the infamous leaders in the 20th century and even today around the world. So it's not just about being a leader, but it's about the type of leader that you should be. But we should also just acknowledge not everybody's a leader. You can put someone of high character in a position that they're simply not only not equipped to lead for, but they're just by character, by definition, that's not the way that they are meant to influence in the world. And that doesn't mean that they're only to follow. It just means that their role in influence is a little different. So leadership does matter. One person really does make a difference, makes a difference in your marriage, makes a difference in the lives of your kids, makes a difference in the lives of your grandkids, makes a difference in the lives of the church, makes a difference in the life of the city, makes a difference in your country. If electing a president doesn't matter at all, and we're just going to ride it out, then why elect a president? Why do you even need the figurehead? So the type of president does matter, and we've seen that certainly in recent years as well. Now we understand typically the ripple effect of a good leader. A good leader, there's a ripple effect that they have, and it seems as if really good leaders are hard to find. I was speaking with a friend of mine who happens to be the CFO of a company, and he's in the C-suite, and he was talking about some of the really poor leadership decisions that were happening in that C-suite, even with the organization, the power plays, the insecurities, everybody trying to prove vis-a-vis the other person. And so actually moving forward as a business is constantly being hindered by all this energy that is being expended in the name of ego and individualism and desire to prove worth and all of those things. So there's a ripple effect in the organization. But here's a different question maybe. What's the value add of a good leader? I understand the ripple effect, but what's the value add? Now, I would suggest that there are three major value adds. And these are somewhat controversial, but stay with me. The first value add is perspective. I think a good leader is someone who's willing to take the perspective of a leader, to see the macro picture, to not be so immersed with all the details that they miss the forest for the trees. Some of the best leaders are actually reluctant leaders, but they're still leaders that have a broader view. They just choose to take a higher perspective. Now, sometimes you have to do that in order to make really tough decisions. You have to see a greater cause and how moving this piece forward impacts that greater cause. This is particularly important in cities. If you're think about the advancement of technologies, okay, if we do this, that will displace Y, right? So, for instance, if we adopt the automobile, then all of the horse and buggy industry is going to be disrupted. Is that something we want to do? How do we retrain those people who only understood the horse and buggy industry? Where do they go? What do they do? And yet, it seems as if we think the future is going to be the automobile. Right? And you can extrapolate that out in all kinds of ways. A leader really brings perspective, and their goal is perspective. A good leader seeks out the perspective of others, whether it's their C-suite team. By the way, why they call it a C-suite? Well, because it gives you the macro leaders in silos, so it gives the CEO or the owner, typically the CEO, a good 360 view of what's going on. You need to be able to trust your C-suite. Why? Because otherwise, how do you make good decisions moving forward? Same thing's true with pastoral leaders. You know, some pastors, they love being leaders for the sake of the authority, but the authority is given by God. That's something that you don't wield for yourself. That's something that you understand comes with the position. What you need to bring is a sense of perspective. It's why you want great elders. It's why you want great deacons. It's why you seek out opposing views. It's because you want to have a good understanding of where the church is, so that you have a perspective of knowing what happens when we move forward. Where should we go? There is a sense of the macro and not the micro. So I think a good leader brings perspective. That's a value add. Second value add is, I think, a good leader brings insight. Insight. By that, I mean a great leader can get to the heart of an issue. They can see what matters in the busyness, for instance, of business. This is something that Steve Jobs was really gifted at. He had almost a poetic view. And he understood that the details mattered to that poetic view, but he kind of kept that romantic poetic notion of design and function at the forefront of his perspective. When you think about Elon Musk, he's getting a lot of press right now, and you think about the technological advancements of Tesla X, or SpaceX or Tesla, or any number of those companies that he has. It's really the insight that says, actually, this is what we can and should pursue, and here's why. You know, we need to push the way we're thinking. It's not technology for the sake of technology. He's trying to bring some insight into the way that we view the world, the way that we view our place in the context of the bigger picture. I think it doesn't matter whether you're Mark Cuban or any other leader, even on the local level, you're just leading your family. You should bring some insight because someone needs to see what is actually happening, despite all of the frenzy that's going on. The toddler can throw the temper tantrum, but someone has to have the insight to see that that's actually selfish and harmful for the toddler. Now, that's a little different than perspective. Perspective is saying, okay, here's where you're at now. One day you'll be a teenager, one day you'll be an adult. But insight deals with the here and now and says, okay, there's going to be a consequence for this action because I know what this is actually doing. You think it's about you not getting your favorite meal or having to take a nap or whatever it is. But I know it's about something bigger. And so the leader brings insight, so perspective and insight. And the third thing that a leader brings is leadership skills. And there are real world skills attached with leadership, with moving groups, with inspiring others, with helping others see why they're there and why it matters. The truth is, somebody has to stand in that position. Someone has to stand in the gap. We love to tear down our leaders. We love to talk about great leaders. We love to unpack leaders. But a lot of leaders are leaders simply because other people don't want to do it. And they're not willing to bear the responsibility. They don't want to look at the perspective. They prefer to champion their own little micro thing. Um, they don't want to have the insight. They want to throw the temper tantrum. And they want to be allowed to do that. And that's an insight into human nature. It's an insight into character. It's an insight into cities and how we group and why we need leaders. And because of those cities, where global trends lead us. So leaders are key, but they are within a context. Churches are key, but they're there to bless and to help. And also, in some cases, to warn. In some cases, say, wait a second, let's be insightful to the city. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You think you're doing something great. It's not as great as you think it is. Cities compete against each other. Cities, there are different places and different senses of belongings. Cities need to know why they belong to each other, why you should belong to the city, and how that city relates to its general sense of longing in the great space of things. Put differently, what kind of a dent do you want to make in the universe? Universe is a term they're used very deliberately, the larger sense of things. And then all of that leads to, where's all this going? What kind of a tomorrow do we actually want to build? And I think if there's kind of in summary, the thing that is frustrating for me at times is that we often abdicate our potential because we're not willing to do the intentional work that it requires to have perspective, be insightful, and develop those leadership skill sets that actually purposes where things are going. And so what happens is we react so often that we fail to respond. And that lack of response has real consequences. And we're seeing that on all kinds of issues. One of these days we'll do a deep dive on some of those issues. But for now, I hope you see how these are connected. Leaders, churches, cities, global trends. And as always, I hope you're able to navigate the intersection of leadership and culture well. We're here to help.